The following podcast may include coarse language, graphic content, and politically and or religiously sensitive material. Those of you who are offended by such content should fuck off. To learn more about Daemoneye Publishing and download free products, visit our website at daemoneye.net. That's DAEMONEYE.net. Hey there, internets. Welcome to the Daemoneye Podcast, a podcast where we discuss tabletop and electronic gaming, sci-fi fantasy fiction, science, technology, geek culture, and Germany's newest crazed talk show, Meine Baller sind sehr heiß und verschwitzt.
Swallow your soul.
Dead by dawn. All right, I'm Tristan.
And this is J. Tyler Burrell.
And I'm Tristan Eifler, and this is J. Tyler Burrell. He got getting ahead of himself. But this is going to be kind of a more informal podcast because both Tyler and myself are a little low on energy right now because we're both very, very busy the last couple weeks. I have been busy with both my work in the lab and my second novel, The Lycanthrope Club Book 2, which has recently been released and has been doing very well. And Tyler has been working on the DSRB and certain personal issues which we won't get into because they are personal.
Also been working on trying desperately to freaking finish, or at least find the time, to work on Dragonfire and to understand what Tristan's saying when he's trying to talk to me but his head is away from the cell phone microphone.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
All right, sorry about that. This will be a much more informal podcast. We don't have a rigid set of topics or much set of topics at all. So let's just kind of blaze through this or get through this as best we can. The topic, such as it is magic and psionics, kind of the metaphysics of games, so to speak, but not metaphysics as in the philosophical branch concerned with the nature of reality and existence. Or, well, not entirely. We're saying this is more about what is the basis for so-called magic and psionics in games. You know, what's going on behind the curtain.
Here's the thing. First off, we have to define our terms. There are several different definitions of magic, but the one that really fits best when we're talking about things such as gaming is the use of ritual and symbology to affect macroscopic change in the world around you without an obvious physical cause.
Okay.
Now, and as far as psionics goes, there's a similar definition, but the differences are the important parts. The basic definition of psionics are the use of internal abilities and skills, often inborn, to affect macroscopic change in the world around you without an obvious physical cause. So, if you look at it, the main difference between the two is that magic is the manipulation of an external force, whereas psionics is the use of an internal force.
That's generally how it is accepted in a lot of different game systems and settings and fictional universes. Magic in D&D and psionics in D&D are kind of like that, although psionics has been so poorly defined in D&D, it's practically a train wreck, especially now.
And then you have works that kind of mix and match the two, but essentially glom them into one, such as the Force in Star Wars, which is the use of an internal, in this case, definitely inborn ability to manipulate an external force to cause macroscopic change.
Yeah, so it's kind of an external versus internal, although psionics can be... psionics are generally more internal. Magic can be more external, but it can be internal as well. You'd say that magic can be a little more broad, but... Anyways, that's one way to define it. If we want to get more fundamental, though, I mean, let's look at some other people's definition of magic. There is Fraser's excellent, though quite lengthy anthropological work, The Golden Bough. Have you ever heard of it, Tyler?
Yeah, I've heard of it. I actually read it back in the day. I think that the best way we could actually define... let me phrase this. The best way that you can think of when you're putting, or the best thing you can think of when you're putting psionics or magic into your work is the reason you're putting it in is because something in your work requires you, either requires you or gives you the need to skullfuck physics.
Basically, give you some more flexibility to. It's just an open what if, you know. But I brought up the Golden Bough because it raises some rather good points about how magic came to be, or at least as an idea of a force in our reality, and how we might be able to apply that concept over to other realities, fictional ones, where it's a real force. Fraser defined, basically two laws of magic early on in the book. I'm probably going to get them wrong, so I'm just going to paraphrase them. One is kind of the law of association. Well, actually, they're both kind of laws of association. Basically, the first one is that like affects like. That is, if you have a doll of someone, if you hurt the doll, it can also hurt the person. That's the whole voodoo, the whole stereotypical voodoo power. And then there's the idea that once a context is made between one thing and the other thing, that maintains a link. So if someone was stabbed with a blade, that blade and that person have a connection. And if you damage the blade, you could damage the person. That was actually an example given in one of his many of his anthropological treatises, where if a tribesman, I think, were stabbed by a spear or something, he would try to keep that spear clean if he could get a hold of it, because if the spear got dirty, then his wound become infected. So there are these two fundamental laws.
Yeah, the law of similarity and the law of contagion.
Yes, that's it. Thank you. So he argued that very early man had not so much a shamanism, but kind of witch doctors or the sorcerers. They had a view of reality which was surprisingly more attuned to modern view of reality of physics. That there are these forces in the world, and they're not gods. They're just laws of magic, and they're just trying to figure out how to manipulate these laws. And that's why, you have, they might be importuning spirits, but it's more of they are drawing upon the mana of the world and using it to do something. So, they see cause and effect. They just aren't able to recognize what actually causes and what actually affects it. They use these two assumptions about like affects like.
Yeah, but back then they suffered severely from pareidolia and had no concept of things like the sharpshooter's fallacy.
Exactly. So eventually what happened is that these wise men, these cunning men, when their magic didn't work, they figured that, I guess our assumptions are wrong. So what's the next most probable cause? Okay, maybe they're gods. So instead of trying to figure out these fundamental forces of the world, we should just, praise the gods and hopefully they'll do some cool stuff for us. So that's how this idea of magic, or how Fraser argued, evolved into religion.
There's this book that I read a little while ago where it's a science fiction book about a potential future, and this one guy, he's not a main character in the book. It's kind of an introductory story part of the book. Anyways, he's trying to make a nuclear bomb in order to hold the city hostage so that he can get on TV and talk about his bullshit ideologies. And the main character is talking to the law enforcement officer. Notice I didn't say police officer. There's a reason for that in the book. Anyways, she's talking to the law enforcement officer about it, and she makes the comment that people do this kind of stuff all the damn time. Why should we worry about him? The law enforcement officer says, because evidently with this guy, the fission fairies smiled upon him, and he now has an actual working nuclear device. And that's a good example of the anthropomorphization of a natural phenomenon. In the case of this book, the natural phenomenon was the public manufacturing system's ability to basically block people from getting extremely hazardous materials such as fissile nuclear material. But every now and again, there are bugs that go through the system, power failures, it's a huge system. There's a lot of complexity in it, which means there's a lot of points of failure and random unexpected interactions. Hence, the fission fairy.
Mm-hmm. And that was kind of the idea of these household gods or, religion. They start as spirits, which are responsible for all these forces, which the wise men couldn't control. And therefore they turned to placating, praising, or bribing them to get stuff done. All right, so let's take a step back here, and of course, in the real world, the very early man had it right. It is a matter of cause and effect. They just failed to recognize what the actual forces were and made assumptions about how the world worked, which were wrong. But in a fantasy world, maybe those initial assumptions weren't wrong. Maybe there actually is a mystical connection between a knife that stabs a person, and maybe a sufficiently or maybe a properly prepared doll can cause a person harm if it resembles them. So, when you're designing magic, sometimes it's helpful to take these certain fundamental principles and decide how they apply, then kind of branch out from that, how magic would work from there.
Actually, I think that would be a very good definition of the difference between a fantasy world and a story that takes place in a non-fantasy world. Would be the idea that the old concepts of cause and effect, contagion, gods, spirits at all, in the fantasy setting are actually real. They're probably not the same as what we would think of from our history and our anthropology, but they're real nonetheless.
Mm-hmm. So that's one thing you could do. So I would recommend you read I would recommend people try reading The Golden Bough. Don't get too deep into it because it is a massively, ridiculously, and painfully long anthropological study. But the first couple of chapters are enough, or pretty much all you need to get kind of this basic idea of Fraser's approach. I mean, he's been criticized a few times for simplifying things, but his work is actually, I think, a little bit ahead of his time, and it's worth visiting every so often.
Yeah, I'd say every so often if you're in the mood for it. But I really didn't like the book when I read it because it just seemed it seemed to follow a lot, like you mentioned, the stories of the old wise men. How they had cause and effect mixed around. It starts off fairly good, gives you some nice firm basis, and then it's like 10 chapters of a guy staring at his own navel getting lost in the woods. That's
more or less what I said, Tyler. The first couple of chapters are good, but the rest are just this. They're studying all these long and, he brings up this certain idea like the sacrifice or spring, and then he goes on for like 20 pages giving examples of how this applies in culture X from New Guinea and so on and so forth. If you want to flip through it, there are actually some good ideas for superstitions and spells in there. It's just a very long, drawn-out book. That's the problem. It's an anthropological thesis, basically, a very long one. So it's good. Just don't try to digest the whole thing at once. You'll get indigestion or your stomach will explode.
Yeah. There's actually, if you're looking for a book that describes the differences between magic and magic settings, I would actually recommend the fantasy book from Steve Jackson Games, for the GURPS system. I wouldn't recommend the mechanics of the book, but I definitely would recommend the fluff of the book. It was very well done. And written by an anthropologist. So.
Are we talking about authentic thaumaturgy?
No. We're talking about how the fantasy book talks about how traditions of magic throughout history could be applied to a game setting and what their basis, what the people who believed in them, what the basis for them was. It also talks about fictional traditions of magic from various different game and book and movie concepts.
All right, I'm not sure if this is the same book, as I know there is a GURPS Magic, but there's also actually a book published by Steve Jackson Games called Authentic Thaumaturgy. Have you heard? Do you know which one I'm talking about?
I've heard of it, but I never read it.
I have a copy of it, but it's not with me. It's written by Isaac Bonewitz, the only person to ever earn a degree in magic from the University of California. He took the make your own degree option. He chose magic. Basically, he's a self-proclaimed kind of neo-paganist, but It's not. I don't think it's as extensive as GURPS Magic, but there are some interesting ideas in it as well. He actually applies rules of physics to, like, he uses joules, for example, to measure how much energy it would take to make a fireball. I'm not kidding.
No, I've like I said, I've heard of it. I've actually referenced the guy several times when talking about the degree that I'm shooting for, which isn't in magic. It's kind of going the opposite direction from that.
All right. So yeah, there are the two other sources, I guess. There's GURPS Magic, which is very good, and Authentic Thaumaturgy, a little less so. Both from
no, not GURPS Magic, GURPS Fantasy.
Oh, GURPS Fantasy. Excuse me. So GURPS Fantasy and Authentic Thaumaturgy, both from Steve Jackson Games. We are not being paid to say
GURPS
that.
Magic is a freaking recipe book.
Fair enough. Yeah, and we're not being paid to say this. They're both good resources. So, all right. So we've talked a lot about kind of the metaphysics of magic in fantasy settings and how to kind of set it up. So let's kind of take a step to the other side of this, psionics. I mean, what would be the justification or the idea that psionics are often found in sci-fi heavier systems. We know systems which try to pay more than a curt nod to actual science, and it's kind of you'd argue it's kind of a way to bring magic into science fiction. So
the easiest way to describe how psionics fit into pretty much any setting is to relate it to the invention of radio. Radio waves have always existed. They inundate us constantly. Even if there is no radio wave transmitter anywhere on the face of the planet, there would still be radio waves. They are coming out of radioactive rocks deep in the earth, coming through the air, output by the sun, coming from stars. Those radio waves would still exist and still be there. Now, instead of inventing a radio wave receiver to actually be able to pick up radio waves, imagine if somebody was born with a very, very simplistic radio wave transceiver in their head.
That would be the basis for telepathy, if you could somehow transmit and receive radio signals or some analogy to them from brain to brain. So it's basically mind-mind interface, wireless.
Exactly. If there was an evolutionary pressure that somehow allowed a mutation to develop that gave people essentially Bluetooth brains, and then they would have kids. Their kids would often pop up with Bluetooth brains, and now you have an entire tribe or an entire family in some village somewhere who are all Bluetoothed together. So if they're hunting, if they're standing watch for barbarian hordes or wild animals, if they're farming and they're getting thirsty, they don't have to worry about putting their tools down and then walking all the way across the field to get some water. Well, they could just call out by Bluetooth to one of their family members who happens to be nearby. Hey, Uncle Bob, could you bring me some water? I'm over in the North Field.
The thing is though, that could actually happen in reality. There's no biological radios on Earth as far as we know, and there probably isn't. But that's not.
Well, we have something that's really, really close when it comes to the ability of birds to tell magnetic north.
That's as close as you can get. However, in psionics, people are attributed more than just mind-mind interfaces. I mean, your hypothetical village of radio receiver and transmitter people couldn't communicate with other humans who lack that ability. Supposedly telepaths, or at least some, could communicate with even those who don't have the internal radio. And other psionics people, gifted people, are supposed to be able to move matter simply by looking at it, to lift giant stones just by staring at them with a vein throbbing, or to teleport. I mean, that goes beyond simply radio wave transmission.
Go back 1,500 years to the start of the Iron Age with an electromagnet, and tell me how long you'll live before being burned as a witch.
But again, it's a matter of energy. I mean, fundamentally, psionics try to be more on this side of reality as it is in our own reality, where there has to be a basis for it. I mean,
yeah, you have, if you're doing a psionic system, you have to have some sort of real physics justification for how psionics
or pseudo real physics,
not necessarily pseudo real physics.
I mean,
not so much for how they work, but for how they're powered.
Yeah, I mean, in fantasy settings with magic, you just say that you draw upon the mana or the energy or the magical energies of the world or your chi. But with psionics,
you can even in a fantasy setting, you can even do what we did in Edition Pi, which was state that magic and psionics both manipulate the same forces. The difference is that the power and skill to manipulate them psionically comes from the user, whereas the power and skill to manipulate them magically comes from the skill of the user. Two separate sources. But if you create a magical fireball and you chuck it at a monster, and you create a psionic fire blast and chuck it at a monster, you still have to roll spell resistance against the monster. Both people still have to roll spell resistance against the monster because you're still chucking supernatural energy at it.
Yeah, but there are no magical fields of ill-defined but easily tappable energy, energy in the harder science fiction, setting, or at least a soft, not even really that much of a soft science fiction. You have to at least give some justification. I mean, because lifting a 100 kilogram boulder 20 feet in the air takes a significant amount of energy.
Actually, if you take a look at some of the more esoteric areas of physics, I can see how that could be done with a relatively really small amount of energy. I just don't see how we could actually do it. I mean, there's a difference between theoretically being able to land people on Titan and actually doing it.
Let me rephrase that to make sure we're on the same page here. Lifting it against the 1G gravitational pull.
Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, where does that energy come from? Does it come from? Is it biochemical somehow? And how is it projected? I mean, you have to start with psionics. You have to at least answer some questions.
Well, theoretically, what you could do is you could encase or in a bubble or saturate said boulder with a field that would temporarily negate the pull of its I forget the name of the field. It's the super saturating field that fills all of three-dimensional space that gives matter its
Higgs field?
Matter, for lack of a better. Yes, thank you. That temporarily severs the ability of the Higgs field of that boulder from interacting with the Higgs field of the rest of the universe around it, and then flick it.
The question is then, how does 3 pounds of gristle and grease, i.e. the human brain, do that?
That's where the hand wavium comes in.
Exactly. So, I mean, in Universal Decay Dead Stars, your hand wavium is 0 point energy, I believe.
Yeah. I use 0 point energy and quantum foam to explain where the energy for psionics comes from, as well as why when you go into a lower gravity field environment, the reach of your effect becomes drastically magnified.
Yeah, that's one of the other, that along with nanotechnology, which is the other hand wave in science fiction. So one could argue, though, that why couldn't you say that's how magic works then in other settings? So could psionics then draw upon some other energy or some other force that permeates the world?
Actually, there's a series of novels called, I think it was, I can't remember the name of it, but the idea of the series, the conceit of the series was that it's far in the distant future. Mankind is spread out throughout the universe, and the further we go, the more weird we get, because the way it works is people get sick and tired of all the constraints of Earth, so they move out and they form settlements near Earth. Then the people who are sick and tired of the constraints of those settlements move out and form more settlements, and culture gets weirder and weirder the further out you go. And then eventually something happens that causes all of galactic culture to go flush and swirly down the drain. Everybody loses contact with everybody else. And it's right about this period of time that a colony ship, Darkover, that's the name of it, the Darkover series. This colony ship lands on a world that has these crystals on the world. And the crystals interact with the human nervous system and essentially tune it to psionic frequencies, basically weird-ass crystal hand-wavium instead of, to explain where the 3 pounds of meat and gristle thing comes from. It doesn't. It's coming out of this, like I said, weird-ass hand-wavium. But it's a as the time goes by, the culture develops into a pseudo-medieval culture, and it becomes a fantasy series where all of the magic in the series is psionic abilities.
I remember you mentioning that once. I remember reading about it, and this a bit of a spoiler warning here. So close your. The anime Scrapped Princess also is along those lines, I believe.
The anime what?
Scrapped Princess.
I'd never heard of it. Email me about it.
Yeah.
Like email me a anime database link or something.
Yeah, Scrapped Princess. I haven't seen much of it, but I think it is kind of the approach that it's in the fantasy world, but there is actually a hard sci-fi or at least a sci-fi justification for what's going on. But my point of bringing that up, the psionic concept drawing upon energy-filled world, is that when you get right down to it, magic and psionics are more fluid than you the difference isn't much. It is kind of fluid. The idea of external versus internal is, I think, the best definition, and also the other definition is magic doesn't really care about making. You throw out all justification as far as real world physics goes, but the psionics, you at least give them a some token respect.
Psionics has to be internally consistent, or at least have a passing familiarity with physics, whereas magic can just completely ignore physics. Otherwise, how do you turn a 800-pound ogre into an 8-ounce mouse?
Well, of course, there are some books, the Spellslinger series, which just kind of takes magic as another sort of science. It's the same philosophy. You have this world that obeys certain rules, and you determine how the rules work through empirical experimentation, scientific methods. Just that this world runs on rules of physics, which are more consistent with the idea of that an ancient wise man might have, that like affects like and contagion.
Oh yeah, the Jareg series by Stephen Bruce does that.
So yeah, I mean, but when you get right down to it, magic does have a philosophy that's kind of different from philosophically what you think of a magic does kind of have a different approach than science. It is more. It doesn't really care about what's going on in the background. It cares more about getting results, so to speak. You don't have to understand why exactly waving the wand in a certain way and chanting a certain series of syllables and thinking of in a certain way causes fireball to explode. It just does. With science is more focused on the how and why, and that I think that's why. I would argue that and there are a few novels with this where you have science versus magic. I think science will always have the upper hand because it is about understanding and applying, not just applying. That's at least my viewpoint of it. Some people might argue otherwise.
Yeah, actually, there's a series of novels. I'm looking it up on Amazon right now, so if you'll give me a couple of seconds. Here it is, by Rick Cook. Oh, there's an anthology series that came out. That works. It's The Whiz Biz by Rick Cook.
I've seen that, yeah.
The idea is that the magical fantasy world, the lands of light are being attacked by the Legions of the Dark. The Legions of the Dark, and everything is powered on magic. The Legions of the Dark are winning because they'll actually do things like human sacrifice in order to get their war machines up and running, whereas the people or the Lands of Light won't, because that kind of goes against their whole ethos of magic is the servant of the people, whereas the ethos of the Dark is the people are the servants of whoever has the magic.
Mm-hmm.
So they one of the more powerful magic users takes a gamble to cast what they call a great summoning, which is the ability to send out into the universe essentially a wish list to summon whatever's on the wish list to you. But it's an extremely long ritual. It sends up a huge magical flare, and it usually gets counterspelled no matter which side is doing it. Well, he takes a gamble of doing a great summoning without any of the preparations that they usually take in order to protect themselves during the great summoning, in the hopes of being able to get it off fast enough that the spell actually goes through. So he casts his spell and he gets to the part where where he has to chant the wish list, and he chants the wish list for the most capable and powerful in all of the universe. I want the most gifted whiz, and then he gets hit by a lightning bolt out of the blue because they finally managed to find out where he is at and fry his ass. So he manages to get out half the word wizard. Meanwhile, back in Mendocino, California, a very gifted computer programmer who's nicknamed the Wiz because he always seems to manage to find whatever bugs and pull whatever software code out of his ass is needed in order to actually do what he needs to, or actually do what he's supposed to do, leaves his work area to go get a soda. He opens up the door to the break room and falls through a magical portal into the middle of essentially this fantasy world where even the blacksmith uses magic in order to keep his furnace going. And he has no magical skill whatsoever because you're born with like a different level of magical know-how. He's just a really good computer programmer. But your ability to be born with magical know-how, it doesn't actually limit your ability to use magic. Even the animals in this world, some of them can even use magic. Magic is a persistent force in the world, and the ability to be born with magical know-how is a lot like your ability to be born pitching a good fastball. It's just an adaptive trait, something that you can actually work at and learn. But if you're born with an innate ability to be really good at pitching a fastball, you're going to be able to pitch a faster fastball than somebody who wasn't born the ability to pitch a good fastball, given equal amounts of training. And he has absolutely no skill at it whatsoever. But once he learns that it's a persistent force that can be manipulated through trial and error, he figures out how to write a magical coding language using the world at large as the processing unit, and basically just the magical compiler that he writes to actually fill out all of his instructions. And while he's working on this, they kidnap the woman the Legions of the Dark kidnap the woman that he fell in love with, and he goes completely apeshit. He writes it gets. Yeah,
I remember you mentioning that a while back. Yeah, and the plot is actually, the whole summon everyday hero. That's a TV trope thing, and that beginning is also very similar to the one in Alan Dean Foster's Spell Singer series, where they summon he wants a great wizard, but in our world they would call an engineer. The problem is he summons a sanitation engineer, i.e. a janitor. But it turns out, so he's not really, because, in this world, magic is, well, let me put it this way. One of the chants involve magical spells, which wizard uses, basically describes how skin repairs itself after being wounded. So in theory, an actual engineer, a doctor, or biologist in this world we're in would be actually quite capable. But our protagonist is not that. He is a kind of a hippie. He is he's a good musician. Fortunately, it turns out he's a spell singer, which gives him a lot of very powerful magical abilities. So that kind of balances out in the end.
Email me a link to that as well.
Oh, you've never read Spell Slinger?
I want to check that out.
Yeah.
No, I
You
haven't.
have not? All right, you should. It's actually quite good.
Yeah, but as far as the Wiz goes, after the first book, he starts actually working at it, and he gets it so that they're like in the stockpile of the magic program library. He ends up making it so that there are a few very simple spells that everybody has access to, even if they normally couldn't pull something off like that before, like healing, like basic healing spells, basic light spells, basic fire making spells, that sort of thing. And he completely by accident ends up giving them a technological revolution, but it's one based on magic.
Though I hope there aren't any demons in that programming code.
Yes, there are.
Of course, I had to do that one. All right.
But they're not like what we would think of like some extraplanar entity summoned to serve a purpose and all of that. A demon in this particular set of program codes, or in this particular world, is essentially a autonomous malicious program.
Anyway, so that's that's the way to kind of present or formulate or to use magic, or this idea of magic in a setting is have it follow almost a scientific or have it be developed in a scientific way, but still kind of have this fantastical basis.
Just make sure that no matter what you do, it's internally consistent. Whether you're using psionics or you're using magic, any justifications, reasons, limitations, and so on that you use, hold to them.
Well, you could argue that you could say that the laws of magic are also ever changing and subject to whims of the gods, but at least that idea is consistent. Don't say it's consistent and inconsistent.
Yeah.
Be consistently.
If that is your justification, that they're subject to the whims of the gods, keep them subject to the whims of the gods. Don't have like some uber magic that even the gods don't fuck with.
And another one which I don't think I've actually read about or seen this series or would be the idea of the virtual world, where there's a virtual world where magic is real. But basically imagine if the Matrix were set in the Forgotten Realms. So,
Funny you should mention that, because I just recently finished reading two book series. Here, hold on. I'm going to pull them up on my Kindle real quick. The first book series is actually a translation of a Russian series that's gone on for 7 novels. And it's really good. It's the Alterworld series. The first one is, of course, not Alterworld, Play to Live. The first book in the series is called Alterworld, Alterworld, and I highly recommend, I cannot state this enough, I highly recommend everybody who's listening to this reads it. It is freaking epic. The idea is that it's in the 2030s, and computer technology and particularly gaming technology have advanced to the point where virtual reality is essentially the norm, or at least the burgeoning norm. The most popular online gaming environments are all virtual reality based, but something weird starts to happen. If you're in a virtual reality world and you're in it for too long, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes you'll end up not being able to get out of it. And I don't just mean that the helmet won't come off. I mean that when the helmet does come off, you're a drooling idiot, but your character is still running inside the game. You can have your brains blown out, but your character is still running inside the game, because you are now a permanent fixture of the game. And even the people who control the servers cannot code you out. You are a permanent, autonomous element of that game, and as far as your virtual self is concerned, that is now the real world. You still have all your memories of the old world, but the old don't have any access to it. That is now your new world. That's the first one that I would recommend. The second one that I would recommend that's on a similar vein, if you'll hold up, I have to scroll to it because I got busy, I was kind of busy, like, blabbering.
We've been blabbering for this entire podcast. That's kind of the format right now. It's an off-the-cuff edition podcasts.
The other one I would recommend, not quite so much, because while it's a good idea, the writing leaves a little bit to be desired. The guy needs to polish up his style a bit. Is Off to Be the Wizard. It's about a hacker who, while tooling around on the internet in I think it's a phone company servers, discovers a data file that has his name in it, and it has all of his basic information in it, including a bunch of stuff he doesn't recognize what it's supposed to mean, and part of that is his height. So he sees it and it's like listed as like 5'8", and he's like, I'm not 5'8", I'm 5'11", and he types in 5'11", and saves the data file, and then gets up to go to the bathroom and hits his head on the lintel as he passes by it, because what he just discovered was a bug in the virtual reality code that is our reality.
The Matrix again,
that allows him to directly not the Matrix, because he doesn't have an independent body outside of our reality. The conceit of this novel is that isn't that we're brains in a jar, it's that we're people who think they could be brains in a jar, but are actually just programs in the system. And you can alter if you can find that data file, or the bug that allows you access to the underwriting script that records that so you can see that data file. You can make alterations to that data file in order to alter yourself and the world in your immediate vicinity. Like, you want to teleport to England, find out the coordinates for some place in England and alter your coordinates in the data file to the coordinates for England.
I think we can classify a lot of the previous examples as sufficiently advanced technologies indistinguishable from magic types of situations.
Whereas in this case, it's magic through technology. They even have time travel just by changing the date.
Yeah, I always would like to think a good idea for a novel would be a typical fantasy setting. Only one day, someone wakes up and they find they're in a life support pod surrounded by thousands of other life support pods. So, and that person happened to be a dwarf. And now he realizes there are no dwarves. It's this entire floating colony in space where people have been living and keeping their brains stimulated and functional by living in a virtual fantasy world.
Actually, what I want to see is a novel that's essentially, the Matrix, where everybody thinks that they're living in the real world, but they're not. They're just, like, in pods. However, somebody manages to figure it out and breaks the system enough to the point where there's like an emergency eject and everybody gets ejected out of the pods, only to realize that they're not humans. They're elves, they're dwarves, they're gnomes who were born in the system and plugged into the system and thought that they were humans, but they instead are by a technological race, or better yet, even by don't have it be technologically based at all, have it be completely magically based. And I don't know, they were being enslaved by demons or something like that. And now they're having to exist in a world where technology doesn't work, but magic does.
So kind of a reverse situation. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I hate to bring this up, but it is an example of the magic through virtual worlds. Dot Hack Sign, the anime. I'm reluctant to do so because it gets way over its head with its philosophical bullshitting.
I couldn't even get through the first episode.
Yeah, it's a bit, it's an interesting idea, but again, it also suffers from kudzu plot and multiple medium strain, where the full long story of the series is carried out through video games, animes, novels, light novels. It's the same problem that Kingdom Hearts has, where, yes, it's great that you have all this long, complicated, convoluted story that runs, the gamut of all these things, but that means following it means you have to buy or read or play every book. If you're an enthusiastic fan, bravo, more power to you, but I think this detracts from the series overall. And it's pretentious as fuck, but still an example of...
Yeah, it reminds me of... when I was trying to get through the first episode, it was reminding me a lot of Dot Hack, and not in a good way, especially considering how I hated Dot Hack.
Well, Dot Hack Sign, it's the same novel.
Oh, it's the same.
Series. Excuse me. Yeah, Dot Hack Sign. Yeah. Well, there are a lot of it's all Dot Hack something. I've stopped paying attention to it years ago, but I brought it up because it is more or less what you've been describing. Especially
no wonder it seems so freaking similar.
Yeah. Anyways, so we've been kind of going on and on about magic. Let's talk about a little bit more about Psionics before we got sidetracked. So, I was saying it's a little more. Sorry, go ahead.
I gotta put on my fanboy hat.
Yes.
For a setting that's not just really freaking well done, and I mean amazingly well done, despite the fact that the studio fucked with it in the season 4, so they had to rush to the end, and then, hey, surprise! I know you just aired your last episode, but we want to order season 5. You hate TNT, but despite all of that, especially for the way it handles psionics, I have to recommend wholeheartedly Babylon 5 by J. Michael Straczynski. It was just done incredibly well, and they had. Okay, I'm not going to go into spoiler territory, but they had an awesome reason for why psionics just suddenly start appearing.
Babylon, yes, one of the cruxes of geekdom culture, especially the older one.
Babylon 5 was just freaking awesome.
Anyway, so as I was saying, a little bit more about psionics, we were saying how it's a little more fluid. It's more of a spectrum from magic to psionics than a distinct border between the two. But that being said, it tends to be more internal. So we talked about what's the source, you have to consider where the energy to manipulate matter comes from. You also have to consider, what laws of physics you're bowing down to and what you're kind of hand waving. So let's think about some common psionic powers. I mean, the stereotypical ones are, of course, mind to mind, communication, telepathy. That's a common one, or empathy, where it's simply you just have extremely high emotional intelligence. You can tell someone is happy or sad just by a single glance and feel it. Another example is telekinesis, moving objects in space, the power of your mind alone. The prefix tele meaning
clairvoyance.
Clairvoyance,
the ability to sense things beyond the normal range of human senses.
Clairaudience, which is basically seeing into the future, so forth. Or there's another term for that, precognition. That's another word for it. Of course, the pyrokinesis, which is setting things on fire.
Yeah. A lot of these fall under the same category. They're just different applications thereof. Like if you have telekinesis, the ability to manipulate objects, then by default you have pyrokinesis, cryokinesis, and electrokinesis under the same rubric, because that's all the manipulation of matter, just in a different way. Pyrokinesis, you're accelerating Kelvinic energy. Cryokinesis, you're reducing Kelvinic energy, and electrokinesis, you're just grabbing electrons rather than whole atoms and chucking them that way.
Well, we could argue that the ones you mentioned are operate on a micro or nanoscale, whereas telekinesis is more of a macro scale. It just creates a brute energy push.
This does bring up another thing about that often occurs with psionic abilities, is the idea of the ability tree, where you have a basic ability and then you specialize in some aspect of that basic ability to unlock a new application of it.
Okay, yeah. Well, that actually also brings another topic. Are psionics all inborn? Do you automatically only have one talent, and then that's it, or can you learn it? If you have it's the idea of if you have psionic potential, can you eventually become a godlike psionic being of all disciplines of psionics, or if you're born with telepathy, the best you can do is get better at telepathy. Those are two different,
in the Dead Star setting, we go with the idea that you have to be born with the base ability, and then you have to train it in order to actually do anything useful with it, other than move coffee cans around.
Yeah, in D&D, to be fair, very few of the psionic systems work very well in any editions, but almost universally, it's you can develop different psionic powers. A telepath can become a telekineticist, and so on and so forth.
I have to disagree with you about Psionics not working well in any edition.
Most
in
editions, excuse
Pi,
me.
it works very well.
Okay, official editions from the publisher of D&D. And to be fair, the one system did kind of work well. The skills and powers option for second edition, which had mental armor class, I believe.
Yeah, that actually did work surprisingly well.
Yeah, but it just I miss bringing it up as an example, two examples, of contrasting approaches where it's basically an inborn mutation, and you can exploit it, you can get better at it, but you can't branch out and develop new variations of it because that's the way your biology is. Yeah. So I think that, would you consider the idea that you have an inborn psionic ability and that's it with some possible permutations and improvement at the skill? Do you think that's more towards a hard sci-fi spectrum of things than you have potential, therefore you could become a god over time?
Yeah, the inboard route is more towards actual hard science, because it's the baseball analogy again. Everybody can throw a baseball, but only people who not just have the inborn talent to throw a baseball, but then practice at it, can become major league pitchers.
I think a more clearer analogy would be, having a certain sonic ability is like being born with an extra leg. And if you don't have that leg, to begin with, you can never run with that leg. But you can still, if you exercise more with that leg, you'll get stronger. A little convoluted, but yeah.
Or being born with, I believe the ability is called heterochromia, which is the blue portion, or your vision spectrum dips into the ultraviolet spectrum.
Heterochromia means actually having two different eyes of two different colors.
It's heterochromia, not heterochromia.
Oh, sorry. All right.
I think it's called heterochromia. It sounds very, very similar to heterochromia.
No, yeah. Okay, I understand how I would mistake them. So, all right, so there's that. That's one thing you want to keep in mind when defining psionics. Another thing is that you also want to consider, I think it's a good idea to consider, it is kind of realistic only to have to have only a couple types of powers. At the same time, you could argue that if psionics has some basis in biology and therefore will have some basis in evolution, there could be a lot of different variations of what you consider a psionic power to be like. So I think we should go over some of the rare or creative examples of psionic powers. Like
that's easy.
Go ahead.
That's easy.
Yeah.
I can think of one off the top of my head.
Yeah. Go for it.
Yeah. Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Specifically,
all of bending.
Ah, I see. Excuse me. I thought
It's all just variations on psychokinesis that are linked. That at least seem to be at least partially linked to to your motor cortex.
Mm-hmm. Other examples would be more biofeedback or metabolism, where you can shut off like pain receptors in the body. Kind of like an extreme example of like co-walking, or or forcing your body temperature to rise, or biocontrol, having complete control over your physiological functions.
Yeah, biocontrol is the ability to gain conscious control over unconscious biological things that your brain normally controls unconsciously. For instance, you can't use biocontrol to accelerate the rate of cell division in order to heal faster. But you can use biocontrol in order to control your vascular muscle tissue, in order to accelerate the rate at which blood flows to a wound to get it to clot faster.
Yeah, it's pretty hard on the scale of science fiction hardness. It's basically the ultimate mind over body.
Science fiction? I thought we were talking about shit that people actually did.
I know, but more extreme examples of that might be causing your epidermis to harden to the strength and consistency of, say, chitin, for example, to create basically a temporary hard skin, or
that's going into the sci-fi level,
or basically body shaping, forming claws, or very sharp, basically body control. Let's see, other examples might be because what you're trying to do is you're trying to think of a biological basis for this. Look at it in nature. and try to think, how if you could have some extreme control over it, maybe even bending a few laws of physics.
Actually, something that came out relatively recently was Sense8. Or the word sense and the number 8.
I know, yeah, it's Netflix. I've almost watched a couple times, so I haven't got into it.
It was really, really good, and it was a great example of an extreme telepathy, but telepathy that applies only within a small group.
It's basically mind meld. Basically, it's a mind meld, so to speak. Hive mind, excuse me.
Yeah, mind meld that hits that enables 8 strangers from across the planet to just completely share their experiences, knowledge, skills, whatnot with one another.
And that's actually another concept, which is a little more towards the soft sci-fi side of things. Astral projection or the collective unconscious. Forgive me, I'm gonna have to step in here because I'm a C.G. Jung fanboy. When Carl Gustav Jung thought of the collective unconscious, he was not referring to the idea that all minds are subconsciously linked by some great mental plane. He was referring to the idea that since humans, or most humans, all develop from the same plan.
Since we share a biology and thus share a brain structure, that there are certain aspects of that brain structure that's going to result in a similar library of concepts.
Such, the mother, the trickster, which he thought would explain how certain figures in mythology and legends are shared. It's not just a coincidence, and also why certain patterns and certain psychoses are shared as well. That was actually a insightful point he made there. But I just wanted to make that clear. That being said, you could also in psionics, you could also say that astral projection and also linking, and accessing the collective unconscious or the Akashic records could be an example of psionic powers. Kind of like the example of Sense8 only. You can access any knowledge or any wisdom or any thoughts among all humans by accessing it. It's basically like every human brain on the planet forms some sort of Wikipedia, and if you know how, you can access it.
Well, actually, in Dragonfire, that's how I'm handling how the deities work. Is the deities are all either solitary or collections of different concepts, such as the trickster, the mother, the father, and the way that, or when you make a prayer to a deity to do such and such a thing, it's what you're doing is you're essentially pulling all of. Let's say you're making you're following a trickster god, and you're making a prayer in order to trick somebody into obeying a simple command to drop their weapon. Well, then your prayer essentially takes a poll of everybody who's thinking about tricks or trickster. Basically, takes a poll of the entire subconscious of all thinking beings, and decides on the basis of that poll whether or not you are worthy in that particular instance of actually having your prayer answered.
So that's another kind of way that psionics and magic, at least the priestly sort, kind of crossover.
Yeah, only in this case, the gods, while we think of them as being some superhuman overarching entity, they are literally man-created, because the quote-unquote father god is literally just an amalgamation of everybody's concepts of fathers.
There's kind of an example of that in the Emberverse from S.M. Sterling. However, I fucking hate the concept behind the Emberverse, and it kind of ruined his other series, the Nantucket series, so I can't recommend it, because it's an interesting idea, but the concept behind the Emberverse, I just absolutely despise what he did with it, and I can't read it. I can't stand it, but I will mention it because it's kind of along those same lines.
Well, I didn't catch what you mentioned, so can you say it again?
The Emberverse by S.M. Sterling.
Oh, I remember seeing that. Yeah, fuck that shit.
Yeah, I won't go into any details because what we're mentioning is kind of major spoiler in the Emberverse, but it is infuriating to me what happens, and I just, even if it is I don't want to be involved in it, which is a shame because his Nantucket series is actually quite good, and unfortunately they're linked, and that means it kind of taints it for me, but I'll leave it at that. Another example of kind of a rare or more obscure psionic ability, psychometry.
Oh, I love that one. That one is so... I love just exploring the possibilities of okay, for those who don't know, psychometry is the concept that thoughts, emotions, just the general taste of a person's mind can be carried on an object that person had, that person came into contact with, that person owned, or even an area they have been in or ground they have walked across. Think of it as being a telepathic bloodhound.
Again, it's kind of more on the soft side of sci-fi, but it's still an interesting idea.
Yeah, it's definitely the soft side, because it doesn't work without thoughts having some sort of weight or persistence.
You'd have to invent basically a new energy source or basically a new type of particle which somehow interacts with minds alone or something like that, which can somehow also interact with matter. I mean, basically you need a PIM particle.
Yeah, good explanation of it.
Which actually is another way to do magic or psionics. You use this to create a new unobtainium, which is kind of a bit of a cop-out, but if you put some thought into it and kind of try to at least reconcile it with existing physics, it's not a bad way of going about it. The mana particle.
The psi particle.
Oh, God!
Wait a minute. There actually is one.
Tyler, that was a horrible pun. Oh.
Yeah, I totally forgot that there actually is a subatomic particle called a psi, or called a psi quark.
That pun caused D6 damage, Tyler. And funnily enough, there is such thing as pun magic in GURPS, where you draw energy from the crowd who hears the puns because it causes them so much pain. That's it. The reason people groan is because hearing horrible puns drains energy from that energy used to create magic. Pun magic.
And on that note, I think we should call this over.
Long, rambling, barely coherent podcast to close. I concur. All right.
Yeah, we've reached the point where we're just pointing and laughing.
Actually, I think there's a lot more we talk about as far as psionic powers, but yeah, for the sake of expense, we'll call it at this point.
Actually, let's save that for another episode some other time.
All right. This has been the Daemoneye podcast, ostensibly. Episode 8, I believe. Yes, episode 8, Magic and Psionics. I'm Tristan Eifler.
I'm the monster under your bed.
And we shall catch you next time.
Ie Cthulhu Fatagan.